My ex's parents begged me to visit their dying son, the same man who betrayed me, but what I told him in that hospital room changed everything. The voicemail came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I almost deleted it without listening. I'd blocked Derek's number 3 years ago, along with his mother's, his sister's, and every mutual friend who tried to explain his side after the divorce. My phone didn't recognize the caller ID, but something about the area code, still burned into my memory after 8 years of marriage, made me hesitate with my thumb over the trash icon. Meredith, this is Patricia Holloway. The voice was smaller than I remembered, stripped of its usual commanding authority. I know you have every reason to ignore this message. I know what Derek did. But he's dying. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors say weeks, maybe less. He's asking for you. Please. I'm begging you. The message ended with a shaky exhale and a phone number I didn't need to write down because it was the same one that had been the Holloway family landline for 40 years. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the morning light creeping through the blinds. My cat, Biscuit, wound around my ankles, oblivious to the earthquake happening inside my chest. 3 years of carefully constructed peace, of therapy and journaling and learning to cook again and remembering that I was a person who existed outside of Derek Holloway's orbit, all of it suddenly felt as fragile as wet tissue paper. My therapist, Dr. Ananya Patel, had spent months helping me understand that I wasn't obligated to forgive. That closure was something I could give myself. That some doors were meant to stay locked. But Patricia Holloway had never begged for anything in her life. She'd certainly never begged me. To understand why I even considered going, you need to understand what Derek took from me. Not just the marriage, though that was devastating enough. Not just the house, which his family's lawyers had somehow managed to classify as a premarital asset despite my name being on the mortgage for 5 of the 8 years we lived there. Not even the friendships, though losing Sarah and Marcus and the entire social circle we built together had felt like a second divorce. What Derek took from me was my career. My identity. My sense of being a competent person who understood the world around her. I was 31 when we got married, a rising star at Westbrook Financial Partners. I'd worked my way up from administrative assistant to junior analyst to portfolio manager in 6 years, the fastest trajectory in the company's history. My mentor, Ellen Chen, had been grooming me for a director position. I was good at what I did, really good, and I loved the precision of it, the way numbers told stories if you knew how to listen. Derek was a real estate developer. Ambitious, charming, connected. His family owned Holloway Development Group, a mid-sized firm with a solid reputation and projects scattered across the Northeast. When we met at a charity gala, he'd seemed genuinely interested in my work, asking questions about market analysis and risk assessment that most people's eyes glazed over during. Finally, he'd said, that first night, someone who speaks the same language. I should have noticed that he never actually answered my questions about his own business with the same depth. I should have noticed a lot of things. The first 2 years were good. Genuinely good, I think, though I've spent enough time in therapy questioning every memory that I can't always trust my own assessments. We bought the house together. We adopted Biscuit from a shelter. We talked about having children someday, maybe, when the timing was right. Derek could be wonderful when he wanted to be. He remembered small details, my favorite flower, the way I took my coffee, the authors I loved. On my 33rd birthday, he surprised me with a first edition copy of a novel I'd mentioned once, months earlier, in passing. He tracked it down through rare book dealers across 3 states. That was the Derek I fell in love with. Attentive. Thoughtful. Seemingly incapable of the casual cruelty that would later define our relationship. Looking back, I can see the warning signs I missed. The way he deflected questions about work with jokes and subject changes. The way his mood darkened whenever his father called. The way he occasionally let slip comments about needing to prove himself to the family, as if their approval was a debt that could never be fully repaid. But love is generous with its blindness. I saw what I wanted to see. Then Derek's company started struggling. A development deal in Hartford fell through. A subcontractor lawsuit drained their legal budget. His father, Richard, had a mild stroke that left him unable to work for 6 months, and suddenly Derek was running operations without the safety net of decades of experience. He started asking me for advice. At first, it felt flattering. My husband valued my expertise, wanted my input on important decisions. I reviewed contracts. I analyzed cash flow projections. I pointed out problems with their financing structure that no one else had noticed. What I didn't realize was that Derek wasn't just asking for advice. He was using my analysis, my work, my intellectual property, to secure loans that I knew nothing about. He'd taken the financial models I'd built for him during late-night conversations and presented them to banks as Holloway Development Group's internal projections. Without my knowledge. Without my consent. With my professional reputation implicitly attached to numbers I'd never formally verified. When the SEC investigation started, I was the first person they called. I found out about the investigation from a colleague, not from my husband. Ellen pulled me into her office on a Thursday afternoon, her face carefully neutral in a way that immediately told me something was catastrophically wrong. "Meredith, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." She slid a manila folder across her desk. "Did you provide financial consulting services to Holloway Development Group?" My stomach dropped. Derek asked me to look at some projections. As a favor. It was informal, just. It's not informal anymore. Ellen's voice was gentle but firm. Their CFO submitted documents to secure a loan from First Atlantic Trust. Documents that include analysis methodologies that are identical to work you've done for our clients. The bank flagged it during a routine audit, and now the SEC is asking questions about potential conflicts of interest. The room tilted. I gripped the arms of my chair. "Ellen, I had no idea he was using any of that professionally. I thought I was just helping my husband with some homework, basically. I never signed anything. I never received any compensation." "I believe you," she sighed. "But the optics are terrible. And Westbrook's legal team is going to have to conduct an internal investigation to protect the firm. You understand what that means?" I understood. It meant that even if I was completely exonerated, which I eventually was, after 8 months of invasive scrutiny that felt like being flayed alive, my career at Westbrook was over. No one wanted to work with the analyst whose husband had stolen her intellectual property. No one wanted to explain to clients why their portfolio manager had been questioned by federal investigators. When I confronted Derek that night, he didn't even have the decency to look guilty. "I was trying to save the company," he said, as if that explained everything. As if my career was a reasonable sacrifice for his family's legacy. "You would have said yes if I'd asked." "Then why didn't you ask?" He didn't have an answer for that. The divorce took 14 months. Derek's family had money and lawyers and a willingness to drag out every proceeding until I was so exhausted I agreed to terms I should have fought. I walked away with Biscuit, my personal savings, and a settlement that barely covered the legal fees I'd accumulated trying to prove I wasn't a criminal. I also walked away with a destroyed career. No firm would touch me. The shadow of the investigation followed me like a bad smell, making recruiters' enthusiasm curdle the moment they Googled my name. Ellen, bless her, gave me the most glowing reference letter imaginable, but it wasn't enough to overcome the newspaper articles, the industry gossip, the permanent association between my name and the word fraud. I was 39 years old, unemployable in my field, and starting over from scratch. For 6 months, I barely left my apartment. I lived off savings and unemployment and the stubborn refusal to ask my parents for money, even though they offered repeatedly. I watched too much television. I stopped cooking, stopped exercising, stopped calling friends. Biscuit was the only reason I got out of bed some days. He needed to be fed, needed his litter changed, needed someone to scratch behind his ears and tell him he was a good boy. Dr. Patel saved me. I found her through a referral from my physician, who'd noticed that I'd lost 20 pounds and stopped making eye contact during routine checkups. The first 3 sessions, I just cried. The 4th session, I started talking. By the 6th session, I was beginning to understand that what Derek had done wasn't just betrayal, it was theft. He'd stolen my labor, my reputation, my future, and he'd never even acknowledged that he'd done anything wrong. "You're allowed to be angry," Dr. Patel said. "Anger isn't the same as bitterness. It can be fuel, if you know how to use it." I started using it. At 41, I launched a consulting practice. Not in finance, that door was permanently closed, but in forensic analysis. Companies hired me to review their internal documents for exactly the kind of irregularities that had destroyed my own career. I was, ironically, an expert in the ways that people misuse other people's work. I was very, very good at catching liars. By 42, I'd built a reputation and a client list and something that felt like a real life. I bought a small condo in a neighborhood I actually liked. I made new friends, people who'd never heard of Derek Holloway, who knew me only as Meredith the consultant, Meredith the woman who laughed too loud at dinner parties, Meredith the person who existed. I hadn't thought about Patricia Holloway's begging voice in 3 years. I trained myself not to think about any of them. But that voicemail sat in my phone like a splinter, and I couldn't stop picking at it. Update 1. I called Dr. Patel before I called Patricia. I'm not sure what I should do, I admitted. Part of me wants to go just to tell him exactly what he did to me. To make him hear it, finally, before he dies. And part of me thinks that's incredibly petty and I should just let it go. What does letting it go look like to you? I considered. Deleting the voicemail. Never responding. Pretending I never heard it. And how does that feel? Like leaving something unfinished. I rubbed my forehead. I keep thinking about all the times I imagined having a real conversation with him. Not a fight. An actual conversation where he finally understood what he'd done. And now he's dying, and this is my last chance, and I don't know if I want it or if I'm just afraid of regretting it later. Those aren't mutually exclusive, Dr. Patel said. You can want closure and be afraid of regret. You can go for selfish reasons and still do something meaningful. The question is whether you can handle whatever happens in that room without losing the ground you've gained. I thought about the condo, the consulting practice, the friendships I'd rebuilt, one careful coffee date at a time. I thought about Biscuit, who purred in my lap every night, trusting that I would keep him safe. I think I can, I said. But I'm scared. Fear and capability aren't opposites either. I could hear her smile through the phone. Call me afterward. Whatever you decide. I called Patricia that evening. She answered on the first ring. Meredith. Her voice cracked. Thank you. Thank you for calling. I haven't agreed to anything yet. I kept my tone neutral, clinical. I need to understand what's happening before I make any decisions. Patricia explained. Derek had been diagnosed 6 months ago, but he'd hidden it from everyone except his immediate family. The cancer had spread aggressively despite treatment. Hospice care had started 2 weeks ago. He was at his parents' house, the same sprawling colonial where I'd spent 8 Christmases pretending to enjoy Patricia's dry turkey and Richard's lectures about tax policy. He's been asking for you since he stopped being able to get out of bed, Patricia said. Every day. Sometimes he forgets what year it is, thinks you're still married, asks where you are. Other times he's lucid and he says he needs to talk to you. That he needs to apologize. Something cold and heavy settled in my chest. He had 3 years to apologize. I know, Meredith. I can't make excuses for him. I won't try. Patricia's voice dropped to barely a whisper. But he's my son. And he's dying. And if there's any chance at all, that you could give him a few minutes of peace before the end, I'm asking you to consider it. Not for him. For me. The audacity of that request should have made me furious. Patricia Holloway, who had sat silently through every family dinner while Richard criticized my career choices. Who had never once called to check on me during the divorce. Who had probably cheered when their lawyers stripped me of everything I'd helped build during the marriage. But her voice sounded nothing like the imperious socialite I remembered. She sounded like a mother watching her child die. I'll come tomorrow, I heard myself say. At 2 o'clock. I'm not promising anything beyond showing up. That's enough. Patricia exhaled shakily. That's more than enough. I hung up and stared at the phone for a long time. Biscuit jumped onto my lap, kneading my thigh with his paws, and I scratched his chin absently. What am I doing? I asked him. He had no answers? Neither did I. The drive to the Holloway house took 2.5 hours. I considered flying. There was a regional airport 20 minutes from their property, but I needed the time to think. To prepare. To rehearse the things I wanted to say. The rehearsals didn't help. Every speech I composed felt either too angry or not angry enough. Too forgiving or too cruel. I kept imagining Derek's face, trying to picture what he looked like now, whether he'd lost weight, whether his eyes still crinkled at the corners when he smiled. The last time I'd seen him was at the final divorce hearing. He'd worn a charcoal suit and hadn't looked at me once. When I pulled into the circular driveway, the house looked exactly as I remembered. White columns. Black shutters. Perfectly manicured hedges. The kind of tasteful wealth that announced itself through restraint rather than ostentation. I'd always felt like an imposter here, the daughter of a public school teacher and a plumber, pretending to belong among people who'd never had to check their bank balance before buying groceries. Patricia met me at the door. She'd aged a decade in 3 years. Her silver hair was thinner, her posture less erect, her face etched with the kind of exhaustion that comes from watching someone you love slip away. Thank you for coming, she said. I can't tell you what this means. I nodded, not trusting my voice. She led me through the foyer, Past the formal living room where I'd never been allowed to sit, past the library where Richard had once explained to me, at length, why women weren't suited for high-level finance. The house smelled like antiseptic and something else, something organic and unsettling that I recognized from my grandmother's last days. We stopped outside a door on the first floor, a room that had once been a guest suite. "He's awake," Patricia said. "He's having a good day, relatively speaking. The nurse gave him something for the pain an hour ago, so he should be comfortable. I'd like to speak with him alone." Patricia hesitated. For a moment, I thought she'd refuse. Then she stepped back. "I'll be in the kitchen. Take as long as you need." I pushed open the door. Derek was propped up in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed softly. An IV drip hung from a pole beside him. The afternoon light filtered through sheer curtains, giving the room an almost peaceful quality that felt obscene given the circumstances. He was unrecognizable. The man I'd married had been broad-shouldered, athletic, perpetually tan from weekends on the golf course. This person, this fragile collection of bones and papery skin, looked like a photograph that had been left in the sun too long, faded to the point of disappearing. His eyes, though, those were the same. Gray-blue and sharp, despite everything. "Meredith." His voice was a rasp, a ghost of the confident baritone I remembered. "You came." I sat in the chair beside his bed, keeping my hands folded in my lap. "Your mother begged." "She's good at that." He attempted a smile. "Always knew how to get what she wanted. Unlike you, who preferred to just take it." The smile faded. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. "I deserve that." "You deserve worse." Silence stretched between us. The machines beeped. Outside, a bird sang something cheerful and oblivious. "I practiced this speech 100 times on the drive here," I said finally. "I was going to tell you exactly what you did to me. Every detail. Every way you destroyed my life. I was going to make you understand, finally, what it felt like to have everything stripped away by someone you trusted." Derek's breath rattled in his chest. "And now?" I looked at him, really looked, at the oxygen tube in his nose, the yellowed whites of his eyes, the tremor in his hands as they rested on the blanket. This wasn't the villain I'd constructed in my mind. This was a dying man who'd made terrible choices and was about to face whatever consequences came next. "Now I realize it doesn't matter," I said. "You're never going to understand." "Not really. You didn't understand when I tried to explain during the divorce. You didn't understand when I begged you to tell the truth about those documents. You're not going to suddenly develop empathy in your last few weeks of life. You might be surprised." His voice cracked. "Dying clarifies things." "Does it? Tell me what's been clarified." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, the words came slowly, as if each one cost him something. "I told myself a story. About how I was trying to save my family's company. About how you would have helped if I'd asked, so it wasn't really stealing. About how your career would have recovered eventually, and you were overreacting." He paused to catch his breath. "I told myself that story for years. Believed it, mostly. It was easier than admitting I was a coward who took the shortcut because I was afraid of failing." I waited, not trusting myself to respond. "The company failed anyway," he continued. 6 months after the divorce. Dad had to sell to a competitor for pennies on the dollar. All those projections you built, all that analysis, it showed that we were going under. I just didn't want to see it. I thought if I could get one more loan, buy one more year, something would change." Hugh laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Nothing changed except your life, and you never reached out," I said. "In 3 years. Not once. No letter, no email, nothing." What could I have said? Sorry doesn't cover it. Sorry doesn't give you your career back. So you said nothing instead. "I'm a coward." His eyes met mine. "I told you. It's the truest thing about me. I was afraid to face you. Afraid of what you'd say. Afraid of how you'd look at me." He glanced down at his wasted body. Funny how a death sentence makes fear seem less important. I sat with that for a while. The machines kept beeping. The bird kept singing. The world kept turning, indifferent to the small drama playing out in this expensive room. A nurse appeared briefly in the doorway, checking monitors, adjusting the IV drip. She gave me a sympathetic look, the practiced compassion of someone who witnessed these scenes regularly. After she left, the silence felt even heavier. "What do you want from me, Derek?" I asked finally. "You asked your mother to beg me to come here. You've been asking for me for weeks. What do you actually want?" Forgiveness, I guess. If you can give it. He shook his head slightly. But that's not fair to ask. I know that. I suppose. I wanted you to know that I see it now. What I did. Who I was. I wanted to say it out loud to your face instead of just thinking it in the dark at 3 a.m. And then what? You think you'll die peacefully because you said the words? No. He held my gaze. I think I'll die knowing I finally told the truth. What you do with it is up to you. I stood up and walked to the window. The gardens were as immaculate as ever, but I noticed now that some of the hedges needed trimming, that weeds had crept into the flower beds. Small signs of decay, of a family too preoccupied with bigger losses to maintain the facade. I built a new life, I said, my back to him. After you destroyed the old one. It took years. It took therapy. It took learning to trust myself again after spending months believing that maybe I really had done something wrong, maybe I really was the person those newspaper articles described. I'm glad. His voice was barely audible. I followed your consulting practice, when it launched. I was proud of you, in a way I had no right to be. You don't get to be proud of me. I turned around. You don't get to claim any part of what I built from the ashes you created. I know. But, I took a breath, feeling something shift in my chest, some knot loosening that I hadn't even realized was there. I'm not going to forgive you. Not today. Maybe not ever. What you did was unforgivable, and I've spent too many hours in therapy learning that I don't owe forgiveness to people who harmed me. Derek nodded slowly. I understand. I don't think you do. Because here's what I came to say, what I didn't realize I needed to say until right now. I moved back to the chair but didn't sit down. You didn't break me. You tried, even if you didn't mean to. You took my career and my reputation and my home and my friends, and you left me with nothing but a cat and a pile of legal bills. And I rebuilt it all. Not the same, better. Different. Mine. His eyes glistened. Meredith, I'm not finished. I held up a hand. You asked what I want from this conversation. Here it is, I want you to know that you failed. Not at the business, not at the marriage. You failed at destroying me. I'm here, I'm whole, and I'm not the broken woman you left behind 3 years ago. That's what you should think about at 3 a.m. Not how sorry you are. How spectacularly you failed to ruin me. The silence that followed was different. Heavier. More final. Derek's face crumpled, tears sliding down his hollowed cheeks. I'm glad, he whispered. Genuinely. That's more than I deserve to hear. I picked up my purse. Goodbye, Derek. Meredith. Wait. He struggled to sit up straighter. There's something else. Something you should know. I'm not interested in the SEC investigation. He cut me off. The reason they focused on you instead of me. It wasn't random. I froze, my hand on the door handle. What are you talking about? My father. Derek's voice was flat. He had a contact at the bank. Someone who owed him favors from years of business dealings. When the audit started, Dad's contact suggested that the irregularities might be explained by an outside consultant with access to privileged information. Someone who wasn't officially employed by Holloway Development. Someone expendable. My blood turned to ice. Are you saying? I'm saying my father deliberately pointed them toward you. He made it look like you were the source of the problem instead of me. I didn't know about it at the time, I swear I didn't, but I found out afterward. After the divorce. After everything. He paused. I should have told you. I should have gone to the investigators myself and explained. But I was a coward. The word tasted like metal. Yes. I couldn't move. Couldn't think. All those months of investigation, of scrutiny, of having my entire professional history dissected by lawyers and regulators, and it had been engineered. Richard Holloway, sitting in his leather armchair lecturing me about how women didn't belong in finance, had deliberately sacrificed my career to protect his son. Does your mother know? No. Dad told me in confidence, after his second stroke. I think he wanted to confess to someone before. Derek gestured vaguely at his own diminished body. Like father, like son, I suppose. Deathbed admissions seem to run in the family. And Richard? Where is he? Memory care facility. The strokes. He doesn't recognize anyone anymore. So I couldn't confront him. Couldn't force an accounting. The man who destroyed my career deliberately, strategically, maliciously, was beyond my reach. Why tell me now? I asked, my voice barely controlled. Because you deserve to know the whole truth? Because you thought it was bad luck, or professional jealousy, or just life being unfair. But it wasn't. It was us. My family. Specifically targeting you to save ourselves. He coughed weakly. I can't undo it. I can't fix it. But you can stop wondering if you did something wrong. You didn't. We did. All of us. I left without saying another word. The drive home was a blur. I pulled over twice because my hands were shaking too badly to grip the steering wheel. At a rest stop somewhere in Connecticut, I sat in my car and sobbed, not the therapeutic crying that Dr. Patel encouraged, but something rawer, more primal. Rage and grief tangled together until I couldn't tell which was which. All those months of the investigation, I tortured myself with questions. Had I been careless? Had I missed something obvious? Had I somehow invited this catastrophe through professional negligence? The investigators' questions had been designed to make me doubt myself, and they'd succeeded brilliantly. Now I understood that the doubt had been manufactured. Engineered by a man who saw me as nothing more than a convenient sacrifice. Richard Holloway had sat across from me at countless family dinners, passing the salt, discussing politics, occasionally offering unsolicited advice about my career trajectory. The whole time, he'd considered me expendable. Less than human. A chess piece to be sacrificed when the game demanded it. By the time I got home, my grief had crystallized into something colder and more useful. Biscuit met me at the door, concerned by my red eyes and shaking hands, and I held him for a long time, his purring the only comfort I could accept. Update 2. 3 months later, Derek died. I found out from a Google alert I'd never gotten around to deleting. The obituary was full of the expected platitudes: beloved son, devoted brother, valued community member. No mention of the SEC investigation, of course. No mention of the fraudulent loans of the destroyed consulting career of his ex-wife. Just a carefully curated portrait of a life that bore little resemblance to reality. I didn't go to the funeral. I didn't send flowers. What I did was hire a private investigator. His name was Marcus Webb, a former forensic accountant who'd transitioned into investigation work after getting burned out on spreadsheets. I'd met him through a professional connection years earlier, and I remembered him as meticulous, discreet, and completely uninterested in moral judgments. I need you to document everything you can find about Richard Holloway's relationship with First Atlantic Trust, I told him. Specifically any communications or agreements that might suggest he influenced how the SEC investigation was directed. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That's a tall order. Bank communications are heavily protected. I'm not asking you to hack anything. I want you to find people who might be willing to talk. Former employees, disgruntled associates, anyone who might have witnessed conversations or seen documents. The goal is to understand what happened. Whether there's enough evidence to pursue legal action is a secondary consideration. And if there is enough evidence? Then I'll make some decisions. Marcus took a retainer and got to work. The investigation took 4 months. During that time, I threw myself into my consulting practice, taking on more clients than I should have, working 14-hour days, avoiding the quiet moments when my thoughts drifted back to Derek's hospital room and the revelations that had reframed everything I thought I understood about my own story. One of those clients was a pharmaceutical company worried about internal fraud. Their CFO had noticed discrepancies in the R&D budget, small amounts at first, then larger, in patterns that suggested systematic diversion rather than accounting errors. I spent 3 weeks analyzing their financial records, interviewing department heads, mapping the flow of funds through their Byzantine organizational structure. The culprit turned out to be a mid-level manager who'd been embezzling for years, using the money to fund a gambling problem he'd hidden from everyone. When I presented my findings to the board, the CFO shook my hand and said, "You have a gift for seeing what people are trying to hide." I thought about that comment during the long nights afterward. A gift for seeing what people are trying to hide. Maybe that was what I developed during the years of betrayal and investigation and rebuilding. Or maybe it had always been there, dormant, waiting to be awakened by circumstances I never would have chosen. Either way, I was good at my job. Exceptionally good. And there was a certain dark satisfaction in using skills I developed through trauma to catch other people who thought they could get away with deception. Dr. Patel helped me process it in weekly sessions. The anger was different now, sharper, more focused. Before, I'd been angry at Derek for his carelessness, his cowardice, his willingness to sacrifice me for his own convenience. Now I was angry at a deliberate conspiracy, a calculated decision by a powerful man to destroy a woman he'd never respected in order to protect a son he'd raised to be equally ruthless. There's a difference between surviving an accident and surviving an attack, Dr. Patel said. Both are traumatic. But knowing you were targeted changes the narrative. It changes what healing means. What does it mean? That's for you to decide. Marcus called me on a Tuesday afternoon in September, almost exactly a year after Patricia's first voicemail. I found something, he said. Or rather, I found someone. A woman named Helen Chu. She was Richard Holloway's executive assistant for 15 years, until she was let go about 2 years before the investigation started. She left under acrimonious circumstances. Financial disputes over severance. You think she'd be willing to talk? I think she's been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. She mentioned your name specifically. Said she always felt guilty about what happened to you. Helen Chu lived in a modest townhouse outside Philadelphia. She was in her 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, and she served me tea in delicate porcelain cups that seemed incongruous with the fury in her voice. Richard was always protective of Derek, she said. To a fault. When Derek started making mistakes, and he made so many mistakes, that boy, Richard, covered for him. Over and over. Until there was no more room to cover. Tell me about First Atlantic Trust. Helen set down her cup. There was a man named Gregory Danes, VP of Commercial Lending. Richard had been cultivating him for years, small favors, dinner invitations, introductions to the right people. When the audit flagged the loan documentation, Gregory called Richard before he called anyone else. And Richard told him to blame me. Not directly. Richard was too smart for that. Helen's mouth twisted. He suggested that the analysis methods looked similar to work being done at Westbrook Financial. Said his son's wife worked there and might have been consulting without proper disclosure. Planted the seed. Let Gregory draw his own conclusions. Can you prove any of this? Helen reached into a folder on her coffee table and pulled out a sheaf of papers. After Richard let me go, I kept copies of certain documents. Call it insurance. Call it spite. Either way. She handed me the papers. These are internal memos from Holloway Development, discussing the investigation strategy. They don't name you directly, but they reference the consulting angle and how it might redirect regulatory attention. I looked at the memos. They were dated weeks before the SEC contacted me. Weeks before my world collapsed. Why didn't you come forward earlier? Who would have believed me? A bitter former employee making accusations against a respected businessman? Helen shook her head. Besides, I didn't have standing. I wasn't the one who was harmed. I just watched it happen and kept my mouth shut because I needed the severance money to retire. And now? Now Richard Holloway is drooling into a cup in a memory care facility, and his son is dead, and you're sitting in my living room asking questions I've been wanting to answer for years. She met my eyes. If you want to pursue this, I'll testify. I'll say everything I just told you, under oath. I should have done it a long time ago. I spent 2 weeks considering my options. The memos Helen had given me were damaging but not definitive. Building a case would require extensive legal work, depositions, potentially years of litigation. The outcome was uncertain. The cost, financial and emotional, would be significant. But there was another option. I called Patricia Holloway. Meredith. She sounded tired. Defeated. I wasn't expecting to hear from you. We need to talk. In person. Not at your house. We met at a coffee shop in a small town halfway between our respective locations. Patricia arrived looking like a woman who had aged another 5 years in the 3 months since her son's death. Her hands trembled as she lifted her cup. I know about Richard, I said without preamble. I know what he did. I have documentation. Testimony from a former employee who's willing to go on record. Patricia's face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about. Your husband deliberately directed the SEC investigation toward me to protect Derek. He used connections at First Atlantic Trust to make sure I was the one who took the fall for your son's fraud. I kept my voice steady, clinical. I was always curious why the investigation focused on me so quickly, so thoroughly. Now I know. Richard would never, he did. I slid copies of the memos across the table. Read them. Patricia's hands shook as she scanned the documents. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face. I didn't know, she whispered. I swear to you, I didn't know. I believe you. And I did, oddly enough. Patricia had been many things, cold, judgmental, blindly loyal to her family, but she wasn't a schemer. She wouldn't have had the stomach for it. What are you going to do? I took a breath. That depends on you. Here's what I told Patricia Holloway in that coffee shop, With the autumn leaves falling outside and the steam rising from our untouched drinks, I told her that I had enough to destroy what remained of the Holloway family's reputation. The memos, the testimony, the pattern of deliberate manipulation, it would make headlines. It would tarnish Derek's memory. It would expose Richard's corruption even though he was no longer capable of understanding the consequences. It would hurt their daughter, Karen, who had always been peripheral to the drama but would inevitably be splashed with the same mud. I told her that pursuing legal action was within my rights. That I'd consulted with attorneys who believed there was a viable case, even years after the fact, especially given the new evidence of deliberate fraud and defamation. And then I told her what I actually wanted. I want a public statement, I said. From you. Acknowledging that I was wrongly targeted during the investigation. Acknowledging that members of your family deliberately worked to shift blame onto me for actions I had no part in. I don't need specifics about Richard's role. I understand he's no longer able to face consequences, but I wanted on record that I was a victim, not a perpetrator. Patricia stared at me. You want me to admit publicly that my family destroyed your career on purpose? I want the truth. Officially. In writing. Distributed to every media outlet that covered the original investigation. I leaned forward. You asked me to give your son peace before he died. I came. I listened. I let him confess. Now I'm asking you to give me something in return, my reputation back. And if I refuse? Then I pursue the legal route. It'll take years. It'll cost both of us enormous amounts of money and energy. At the end of it, I might win or I might lose, but either way, your family's dirty laundry will be spread across every business publication in the country. Richard's legacy will be destroyed. Derek's obituary will have an asterisk next to it forever. I watched her calculate. Patricia Holloway had always been good at calculations, which charitable boards to join, which dinner parties to attend, which alliances to cultivate. Now she was calculating whether protecting the memory of her husband and son was worth the destruction I was threatening. You're blackmailing me. I'm offering you a choice. That's more than your family offered me. 3 weeks later, Patricia Holloway released a statement through her attorney. It was carefully worded, vetted by legal professionals, designed to minimize liability while maximizing apparent remorse. But the core message was clear. During the SEC investigation of Holloway Development Group, evidence suggests that certain individuals within the company deliberately misrepresented the role of Meredith Chen, the former spouse of Derek Holloway. Ms. Chen was not responsible for any of the irregularities that prompted the investigation. She was, in fact, a victim of internal misdirection designed to protect other parties. The Holloway family deeply regrets any harm caused to Ms. Chen's professional reputation and personal well-being. It wasn't a full confession. It wasn't an admission of the deliberate, targeted destruction that had upended my life. But it was enough. The statement was picked up by every outlet that had covered the original investigation. Financial journalists wrote follow-up pieces reassessing the case. Ellen Chen, my old mentor at Westbrook, called to say she'd always known I was innocent and was glad to see it officially acknowledged. Former colleagues reached out with apologies for distancing themselves during the investigation. My consulting practice saw a surge in new clients. Apparently, people appreciated working with someone who had been publicly vindicated, who had fought back and won. I hired 2 additional analysts to handle the workload. I raised my rates. I moved into a larger office with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Friends I hadn't heard from in years reached out. Some wanted to apologize for distancing themselves during the investigation. Others wanted to celebrate my victory. A few, I suspected, just wanted to be associated with the dramatic story that was circulating through professional networks. I accepted apologies selectively. Some people had no choice but to step back. Their own careers would have been threatened by association with me during the investigation. Others had actively participated in the whisper campaigns, spreading rumors and speculation that made my situation worse. Those people could stake on. What surprised me most was the response from strangers. My consulting website received hundreds of messages from people who'd read the news coverage. Many shared their own stories of being wrongly blamed, of fighting systems designed to crush them, of feeling invisible and powerless. They wrote as if I'd given them permission to believe that fighting back was possible. I couldn't respond to everyone individually, but I read every message. They stayed with me, accumulating into something that felt like responsibility. All these people, suffering silently, needing someone to believe them. Needing the kind of help I'd been fortunate enough to afford. That was when the idea for the foundation first took root. I was finally, fully, free. But here's the part I didn't expect. I wasn't satisfied. Not in the way I'd imagined satisfaction would feel, anyway. I'd pictured vindication as a kind of euphoria, a permanent high of justice achieved. Instead, it felt more like setting down a heavy bag after carrying it for miles. Relief, yes. Lightness, definitely. But also a strange sense of emptiness, of not knowing what to do with hands that were suddenly free. Dr. Patel helped me understand this too. You spent years defined by what was done to you, she said. First as a victim, then as a survivor, then as someone seeking justice. Now that chapter is closed. The question is, what story do you want to tell next? I thought about that for a long time. A year after Patricia's statement, I started a foundation. Not a large one, I wasn't suddenly wealthy, but enough to fund legal assistance for people who'd been wrongly targeted in corporate investigations. People who didn't have the resources to fight back, who couldn't afford private investigators or years of legal fees, who got crushed by systems designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the expendable. I called it the Second Chance Initiative. Helen Chu served on the advisory board. Ellen Chen became one of our major donors. Marcus Webb consulted on cases pro bono when his schedule allowed. The work was slow and often frustrating. Most of the people we helped never got the dramatic vindication I'd achieved. But sometimes a wrongful termination was reversed. Sometimes an investigation was redirected toward the actual perpetrators. Sometimes a person who'd been destroyed got a chance to rebuild, the way I had. Our first major success was a woman named Candace Robinson. She'd worked as a quality control supervisor at a manufacturing company for 18 years before being blamed for a safety violation she'd actually tried to prevent. Her supervisors had ignored her warnings, then made her the scapegoat when an accident occurred. She lost her job, her professional license was suspended, and she spent 2 years fighting to clear her name. When she came to us, she was near bankruptcy. Her husband had left, unable to handle the stress. Her children barely spoke to her, embarrassed by the scandal that had made local news. Our team found internal emails showing that Candace had reported the safety issues months before the accident. We found evidence that her supervisors had falsified inspection reports. We found a pattern of cover-ups that extended far beyond her case. The day her name was officially cleared, Candace called me in tears. I didn't think anyone would believe me, she said. Everyone kept telling me to move on, to accept what happened, to stop fighting. But you believed me. I believed the evidence, I told her. The evidence believed you. That distinction mattered to me. It wasn't about faith or intuition or gut feelings. It was about doing the work, following the trail, finding the truth that someone had tried to bury. That was what I could offer people. Not hope, exactly, but something more reliable, methodology. We helped a former bank teller who'd been accused of theft by a manager who was actually the thief. We helped an engineer whose innovations had been credited to his supervisor. We helped a teacher who'd been fired over fabricated misconduct allegations after she reported financial irregularities in the school district. Each case taught me something new about the ways power protects itself. The wealthy had lawyers and connections and the presumption of innocence. The vulnerable had documentation they didn't know how to use and voices no one wanted to hear. We tried to balance those scales, one case at a time. On the second anniversary of Derek's death, I went back to the Holloway house one last time. Patricia had sold it, finally. The new owners were a young family with 3 children, and they'd already started renovating, tearing down walls and adding windows, transforming the formal, forbidding structure into something warmer and more alive. I parked across the street and watched the children playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the autumn breeze. They had no idea what had happened inside those walls. For them, it was just a house, a home, a place where their lives would unfold in ways they couldn't yet imagine. I thought about Derek, decomposing in the family plot at the cemetery down the road. I thought about Richard, unaware of anything, trapped in a mind that had forgotten all its cruelties. I thought about Patricia, who had texted me once to say thank you for the statement offer, for giving her a way out that preserved some dignity, even if she didn't deserve it. I thought about who I'd been when I first walked through that front door, a nervous 31-year-old trying to impress her new in-laws. I thought about who I'd become. Then I drove home to my cat, my condo, my life. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel ever again. I felt grateful. Not for what they'd done to me. Never that. But for who I'd become in response. For the strength I'd discovered. For the community I'd built. For the people I'd helped and would continue to help. For the simple, stubborn fact of my own survival. Biscuit greeted me at the door, meowing indignantly about his dinner being 10 minutes late. I fed him, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and sat on my balcony watching the last light fade from the sky. My phone buzzed. A text from one of our foundation clients. The company agreed to settle. I'm getting my job back. I don't know how to thank you. I smiled. You don't need to thank me, I typed back. Pay it forward. Help someone else when you get the chance. The response came immediately. I will. I promise. I believed her. That was enough. Sometimes I still think about the voicemail that started everything. Patricia's voice, small and desperate, asking me to give her son a few minutes apiece. I'd gone for selfish reasons, to confront him, to demand acknowledgement, to prove something to myself. I hadn't expected to leave with information that would change everything. I hadn't expected the journey that followed. Life is like that, I've learned. The moments that seem like endings often turn out to be beginnings. The worst things that happen to us can become the foundations for our greatest strengths. The people who try to destroy us sometimes end up showing us exactly how indestructible we really are. Derek Holloway took my career, my reputation, my sense of safety in the world. His father made it deliberate, made it malicious, made it a conspiracy instead of a casualty. And in return, I took something from them too. I took the satisfaction of having broken me. I took the narrative that I was weak, that I was disposable, that I could be sacrificed without consequence. I rewrote the story. My story. On my terms. And that, in the end, was the greatest payback of all. To anyone reading this who has been betrayed by someone they trusted, who has been targeted by people with more power and fewer scruples, who has watched their carefully built life collapse into rubble, I see you. I know how dark it gets. I know how impossible rebuilding feels when you're standing in the ashes. But here's what I want you to remember, what I wish someone had told me during those months when I couldn't get out of bed, when I couldn't imagine any future worth living. You are not defined by what was done to you. You are not the worst thing that happened to you. You are every choice you make in response, every moment you refuse to give up, every small act of courage that brings you one step closer to the person you were always meant to become. The people who hurt you don't get to write your ending. That's your story. Yours alone. And it's never too late to pick up the pen.